Well, beginning last couple of Sundays, we were looking at eating with Jesus. Those instances in which Jesus either was invited to go and eat with someone or a group of folks, or the instance in which he invited himself. And I started the first sermon with identification of the book in Revelation, the story in Revelation, in which Jesus is said to have said, I knock at the door, and if you hear my voice and open the door, I'll come in and I'll eat with you, and you will eat with me. Keeping in mind that eating is not only physical, but mental and spiritual. I want to read the story of Zacchaeus. And I'm reminded of that children's song that the kids, I'm sure, learned years ago about Zacchaeus, about a wee little man was he. Jesus went out into Jericho and was passing through. There was a chief tax collector there named Zacchaeus, who was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but he was a little man and could not see Jesus because of the crowd. So he ran ahead of the crowd and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus, who would be going his way. When Jesus came to that place, he looked up and said to Zacchaeus, "Hurry down, Zacchaeus, for I must stay in your house today." Zacchaeus hurried down and welcomed him with great joy. All the people who saw it started grumbling. "This man has gone as a guest to the home of a sinner." Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Listen, Lord, I give half my belongings to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone, I will pay him back 4 times as much." Jesus said to him, "Salvation has come to you this day. This man also is a descendant of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." I want to start with something light, first of all, because I love the internet for the sake of being able to find delightful things to respond to and share with you. And what I spotted was some humorous comments, at least to me, about eating. For instance, consider this one. Life is uncertain, eat dessert first. That's not a bad advice. For those of you who remember Orson Welles was this kind of a mystery murder filmmaker, kind of portly fellow. And he said, "My doctor told me I had to stop throwing intimate dinners for 4 unless there were 3 other people with me." How true. Dolly Parton, on the other hand, advised, "My weaknesses have been food and men, in that order." And finally, someone by the name of Barbara Johnson proclaimed, "A balanced diet is a cookie in each hand." Well, not a lot of humor in that, I guess, maybe. But it emphasizes the idea that food is oftentimes on our mind. You know, what's for dinner? What's for breakfast? What's going to happen when we go to the banquet? Go out to eat. What are you going to choose? What am I going to choose? Should we split a meal? All of that is so much a part of our thinking. And we are comfortable and reasonably well off. Imagine what people must be thinking who are finding their food in a garbage can dumpster or at the dump pile. Perhaps you'll recall last Sunday I indicated that there were at least 10 stories of food in the Gospel of Luke, and that 7 of those stories were unique to Luke. Only Luke had them. Now, Luke gained insight from Mark. He gained insight from some other messages that had already been circulated, and he gained insight from traveling throughout the place where Jesus had been and where people had decided to follow him and become part of this new movement within initially the Jewish community, and then in time it became the Church of Jesus Christ. So of those 7 which are unique to Luke, the story of Zacchaeus is one of those very special stories, it seems to me. Let me give you the background again. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Now keep in mind that he was a Jew, he was part of the Jewish tradition and part of the Jewish faith, and as Jesus said, he was a descendant of Abraham. He was one of the kernels of sand that Abraham was told that your descendants will be more than the sand on the beach. So this Zacchaeus obviously had done well financially because he was identified as wealthy. And that meant he had a home, and that meant that he had resources to do whatever he wanted to do. Zacchaeus was hated by the community. Hated not so much because he was a tax collector, but hated because he cheated so much. And the common thing for the tax collectors, including Matthew, who had been a tax collector, and other tax collectors who had come to be in the presence of Jesus, what they would do is they'd collect $10 worth of taxes, one for Rome and one for me, and one for Rome and one for me. And so out of $10, 5 for Rome and 5 for me. And if well invested, it could account for his being a wealthy person. Now, in addition to being morally small and short of conscience and faith, he was also short stature. And we're told that he wanted to see Jesus, not talk to him, just see him. And because he was so short, he couldn't see over the crowd. I know something about that because I'm 5'6 1/4. It used to be 5'8", and I keep shrinking. By the time I'm 102, I'm going to be about 4 foot high, I think. It's the hard life I live, or it's gravity, not sure which. Anyway, he was a short person in stature. And so he decided he needed to do something. There were 3 things he could have done. One, he could have just given up and said, I can't see over that crowd, so I'm probably not going to see Jesus. He could have just gone home. Or he could have, when the crowd finally arrived, he could have pushed his way through the crowd. But being a tax collector, he probably wouldn't have made it through the first couple of rows. So he decided to climb a tree. Now, I don't know if you know what a sycamore tree looks like, but some of the common sycamore trees have several branches at the base, much like what happens when a pine tree begins to grow and seed, and then it splits for some reason. And then there are 2 trunks that come up. Well, some of the sycamore trees had several trunks. And so it made it relatively easy for Zacchaeus to move his way up through the tree to get to a branch strong enough to hold him so that he might be able to see Jesus. And there he was. The crowd came, Jesus with them. He can see Jesus, which is what he had set out to do. And Jesus does something really rather amazing because it didn't happen hardly at all anywhere else in the Gospel account, except for the disciples and except for 1 or 2 other people. But oftentimes Jesus would meet somebody who would be nameless, and Jesus wouldn't name them by name. He would just encounter them. The man who was deranged, mentally ill, severely schizophrenic, was dangerous to the crowd, was chained, and he didn't name him by name. The man who came who was lame on a stretcher didn't name him by name. There are very few people that Jesus actually named by name when he first met them, which would perhaps indicate his incredible divine understanding of things that you and I might not know. But he said to this person who's now in the crook of a tree, trunk and branch, Zacchaeus, come on down. I need to stay at your house today. So the surprise to Zacchaeus is that he was noticed. My hunch is he wanted to be unnoticed. Kind of like when we have done something stupid, like when you're skiing down a slope and you have what's called a yard sale, when you fall and everything goes flying in every different direction. You look around to see if anybody saw you, and then you get up and collect all your goodies. Well, Zacchaeus, I think, didn't want to be seen because he was not at all liked, and he was aware of that. All he wanted to do was to see this Jesus because he was curious. But one is led to believe that there was something more than just wanting to see Jesus, because when Jesus said to him, Zacchaeus, by name, and by the way, when we are baptized, we give our children a name. We identify them, and the rest of their life, they will be known by that name. I am Erwin George Teichmiller, and I have never lost that name. So I'm known as Erwin or Irv because my brother couldn't pronounce W's very well, but somehow could pronounce a V. So he comes down hurriedly, which would indicate perhaps, and I'm only guessing, that he was actually interested in something more than merely seeing Jesus. So the invitation was to come to Zacchaeus' house. Now, you may recall that by Jewish law, if you were invited to come to someone's home, or if you, like Jesus now, who's traveling through Jericho, he's a stranger, he's a sojourner. And when the sojourner knocks on your door and asks to come in, by Jewish law, you're obligated to do so, not with obligation, but with joy. Because the sojourner, the stranger, is equal to you in the land of the Lord. And so it can be assumed that not only was Jesus welcomed because of the enthusiasm of Zacchaeus, but was welcomed warmly and enthusiastically into his home. And it is also assumed that he also then had the benefit of all of the special things that Zacchaeus' home would provide. Security, a place of warmth and comfort, a place to sit and visit and converse, and a place to have a meal. And if I'm assuming Jesus stayed through the night, the next morning he would have been greeted warmly and graciously, perhaps with fresh clothing and a fresh meal and a blessing on his way. So we eat with Jesus and Zacchaeus. And what happens to Zacchaeus is that his conscience obviously has overwhelmed him. And it's now more than just seeing Jesus. He wants to relate to Jesus. This is such an intimate story of two people encountering one another around issues that are really important to one's not only personal survival, but spiritual survival. We encounter people all the time. We know not much about one another until we engage one another. I was talking last night with someone who was at the University of Wisconsin football game, and it turned out that the person lived 3 doors down from where he later moved to live in Hazelhurst. So my good friend Rick Klatt and Joe Mostelski and their wives began to be good friends. And it was Joe, who was a part of the Rotary Breakfast Club, who said to Rich, why don't you come and join us in Rotary? We don't know much about one another when we first meet, but as we begin to have this connection, this relationship, we begin to know more about one another. It is indeed true that as a result of COVID, which isolated us, and as a result of our being able to hook up with people who were away from us, and we, for a while, we could go on Zoom. And as Phyllis Cussard said, I've learned more about this congregation than I had ever known in all the years I've been part of this church. And in the process, we begin to care even more about each other. And we become more interested in what's going on when you're not here on a Sunday morning. You become more interested in hearing that there's been an illness in the family, or we become more interested because now we know that a great-grandchild is suffering with infant cancer, or we learn about a daughter who's struggling with cancer of her breast. We learn about one another, and we now are part of each other. It's as if we bring each other into ourselves, and we let others into us, and they let us into them. Zacchaeus, come on down. I need to stay with you today. And from that comes a total revision, a 180-degree turn away from what he had been doing to becoming a man of gentleness, compassion, concern, not only for his soul, but for the souls and the well-being of others. We welcome sojourners to our worship every Sunday. We are glad to have you here. We trust that you'll stay and come back and become part of who we are so that we can become part of who you are. That's the gift that comes as we eat together, not only food, but the good news of Jesus Christ. That is such a wonderful gift that nourishes our soul and our lives. Amen. Well, let us identify the ways in which